Welcome everyone. Great to have you along for sermon prep. This week we're looking at the 21st Sunday of Ordinary Time in Year B. So we're looking at Mark's Gospel most of the time during this year. But of course, for these last few weeks we have been reading from John's Gospel. We've been reading the 6th chapter of that Gospel, the Bread of Life Discourse. I mention this because, of course, last week this discourse, our reading of chapter 6, was interrupted as we celebrated the great solemnity of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary into heaven. So perhaps because we did not read from John's Gospel last week, for the 20th Sunday of Ordinary Time, we missed that. Perhaps you would like to go and read that as you prepare for this Sunday, because we then get a fuller picture of the story of the Eucharist, what it means, and the demands that are made on us who believe in the Eucharist. So if you want to, go and have a look at the 20th Sunday of Ordinary Time, Year B. Look at the Gospel particularly. I'll give you the reference here so that you can go and read it. So read that in conjunction with the Gospel for this Sunday, the 21st. So last week's Gospel that we didn't read, John chapter 6, verses 51 to 58. In that Gospel, what's important to take from that extract of chapter 6 is, "My flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed." And it's that statement particularly that's really going to cause a bit of upset and difficulty for the followers of Jesus. And we read about the challenge that statement is in our Gospel for this Sunday. So it's good to get a fuller picture. Okay, that might help. So what are the readings for this Sunday? The first reading is taken from the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter 24, verses 1 to 2, and then 15 to 17, and then 18. The responsorial psalm is Psalm 34, and we have the response that we've been using for these Sundays that have looked at chapter 6 of John's Gospel. Taste and see that the Lord is good. And if you look at that psalm, it's really comforting and an encouraging psalm. And it speaks to us of the goodness of God. We can experience that for ourselves in the Eucharist. But of course, not only in the Eucharist, in so many other parts and aspects and dimensions of our lives. We experience the goodness of God. And I think in these dark and troubled times, that should bring us some sort of comfort and strength. So the psalm is encouraging. The second reading is taken from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and it's the famous chapter 5, verses 21 to 23. Why do I say the famous chapter 5? Well, it's a little bit controversial, I suppose, for some in our modern world. It looks at the morality and the problems and challenges of marriage, what wives should do and what husbands should do. And many feel that it is a bit discriminatory. Perhaps St. Paul has a negative attitude to women. So that's why the 5th chapter of St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians is sometimes a little controversial. But we'll come back and have a look at that and consider whether it is really all that controversial, or whether it really is negative towards women, wives. and then our gospel. John chapter 6, verse 60 to 69. We read in this gospel the challenge Jesus is teaching. His discourse on the bread of life is to his disciples. Those who have gathered round to listen to him are challenged by what he said last week. My flesh, my blood. And they're challenged by this. And some decide they can't accept that and leave. And Jesus asks his apostles, those closest to him, are you going to leave too? And Peter makes a decision and speaks on behalf of the other apostles and disciples and says, no, who do we go to? You have the message of eternal life. And so in many ways, the Eucharist is a challenge. It calls us every time we celebrate it to consider what we are doing and to renew our commitment to Jesus in the Eucharist every time we celebrate it, every time we come for communion. We have to affirm our faith and our commitment to it. And that is not always easy. But it's never been easy, has it? It's always been a challenge. The other point for us to consider, I think, is really important for us to consider, is that the Eucharist calls us to look at our faith in totality, to consider the whole truth of Jesus, just as those first disciples were challenged by it. Who is Jesus? What is he doing? What did he do? What does he continue to do? What is my response to that? So, in other words, the incarnation, his life, his passion, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, and his promise to come again in glory at the end of time. That's the Jesus truth we need to commit to when we say Amen before receiving the Eucharist. The Eucharist calls us to a total commitment to the whole truth about Jesus. And that's what those followers of his battled to do. And sometimes it's a struggle for us too. And so we are called to consider that the Eucharist is almost a decision-making moment. And we need to make decisions about our faith. We need to think about our faith. We need to reflect on who Jesus is for me. And that changes every day, perhaps. So the gospel is familiar to us, and it should challenge us this week. Talking about decisions, that's really what's happening in the first reading. A little bit of context for you. The tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, have gathered in Shechem, a place of worship. And Joshua is addressing them. Remember, he has led them through the Jordan to take possession of the promised land. Remember, Moses, because of his doubting and lack of trust in God's guidance through the wilderness, he has not been allowed to lead the people through the Jordan into the promised land. He sees the promised land from a distance. The task of settling the people in that promised land after their desert wanderings has fallen to Joshua, and he's done a really good job. And this is a little bit after they have come across. And they're encountering all the people who live in that promised land. They didn't come into a land that was empty. There were people living there, communities, groups of people. And they had their own gods like the Baals. And because they're now settling into the rhythm of their new environment, the tribes of Israel are sort of being attracted to these other ways, other cultures, other gods. And Joshua gathers them together and says, it's time to make a decision here, guys. Are you for God, the God who led you out of the land of Egypt through the desert, gave you this promised land? Are you for him, or are you going to follow these other gods? You must make a decision. And so, yeah, that's the link, I believe, between the first reading and the gospel. Decision for God. Decision against those other things. And perhaps those other things can be very attractive. They can be easier, and we're really attracted to go for that other option. Sometimes God is challenging, like we see in the gospel. Sometimes his teachings are more difficult. But we need to reflect on that, and we need to make the decision for or against God. So that's the context of the first reading. As I said, St. Paul's 5th chapter of his letter to the Ephesians is rather famous. Some might say infamous. The first part of that chapter, he looks at the duties of wives, and then he looks at the duties of husbands. Perhaps this is the thing that grates some people, some women perhaps particularly, some wives. Brethren, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. Some women say, what does that mean, to be subject? To be lower, to be less, to be a servant, a slave perhaps of my husband, to do whatever he wants. Is that what that word subject means? And then it's sort of the problem is compounded a little bit, because St. Paul doesn't say when he's looking at husbands and their duties, he doesn't say they must be subject to their wives. So he says, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church, his body, and is himself its Saviour. As the church is subject to Christ, so let wives also be subject in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her. And so St. Paul doesn't say that husbands should be subject. He doesn't use that word, that husbands should be subject to their wives. But is not the love of Christ for his church, doesn't that contain elements of subjection, service? I think it does. I think in some ways, for us, the Christian understanding of love is to be subject to another. Jesus subjected himself to the will of God the Father and gave himself up in loving service for the church. That's the love a husband and wife must have for one another. And so love is about self-sacrifice, a giving up of what we want for the other. So to use that word love in some ways resembles being subject, giving up ourselves for the other. So perhaps the words subject and love are not really very different at all if we stop and consider the word love from a Christian or Christ-centered way. So yeah, that's something for us to think about. And if we are to say that, then perhaps it's not so difficult a reading. It's not so contentious a reading, really. Also, yeah, St. Paul is looking at marriage from his perspective, from his cultural, historical context. He says it as it is, doesn't he? He doesn't say it's good or bad, really. And we've got to accept that. That was St. Paul's context. Perhaps in our modern world, marriage, the concept of marriage and the responsibility of husband and wife and children in a modern world has grown or changed or developed. And so, yeah, we must accept that in some ways. But the fundamentals of love, a love that is self-sacrificing, that I don't think has changed. And both husband and wife, and obviously children and family, that should be the model, that should be the goal, that should be our desire, to love like that, to give ourselves for one another. And in doing so, we mirror what Christ did. And that love is about sacrifice giving. And I think, although it might be difficult to see this, I think that is the link with the Eucharist. The Eucharist is God emptying himself, being broken, poured out in service, in love for his church, for his people. And so in very many ways, marriage, family life, calls us, challenges us, asks us to decide, to commit, to be Eucharistic people, to be broken, poured out in service of those we love, most especially. And so I think there is a link between the second reading and the Gospel, the Eucharist, which is about love and thanksgiving for the love that people have for us and our love for others. Okay, so those are some thoughts for this 21st Sunday of Ordinary Time. I hope to see you either online or in person. It's really important that we keep working to build this community that is centered around the Eucharist. It is the greatest gift to our community. It's the thing that nourishes our community. So I hope that you will come and be part of our celebration of the Eucharist this Sunday. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, be safe, and if you haven't had your vaccination, why don't you give it a thought and go and get it done? I've had my 2 now. I feel a lot safer, and I also think that I'm by doing that, trying to prevent the spread of this virus. So as the Holy Father said on Wednesday at the general audience, let's see vaccinations as an act of love, service for others. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.